Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Happy 420. Today we'll be talking about the situation in Bakhmut on its flanks. Let's begin by the southern flank. And over here, the Russians previously held positions in quarries and other facilities to the west of the canal. This is the Donetsk-Donbass canal. This canal, I'll outline where it runs, and so it's about here. And so the Russians basically had a bridgehead to the west of the canal, and the front line looked something like this, where the Russians had control of some forest belts, that had control of some open fields, some minor roads, and as I said before, the quarries. And so these positions are on pretty high elevation, about 210 meters above sea level, which is similar to the elevation on Chasiv Yar, which would sort of render Ukraine's advantage topographically. It would sort of render it useless because the Russians would have very similar elevation to the south of Chasiv Yar, and it would also give them a flank and a staging area to begin attacks towards the T-0504 highway over here, and then advancing further north into the southern parts of Chasiv Yar. And so that would be the threat of Russia's bridgehead around here. And so as a result, the Ukrainians, they really coalesced an entire grouping of brigades. So there are multiple different brigades and different minor units that were involved in this, but they were able to push back the Russians from their positions over here. It's also important to remember that the Wagner group, they really don't have a presence on the flanks anymore. They're mainly focused on clearing out the city of Bakhmut itself, and so the flanks have really been the responsibility of the regular Russian army, and it's possible that they were not given the proper amount of men to hold on to these fort positions, and so they just decided to retreat to a better position, which is just along the water canal, because it will certainly be difficult for Ukraine to cross this canal now and take over entrenched Russian positions to the east of the canal, because there are probably a lot of trenches and a lot of fortifications centered around some of these towns like Klishivka, and then also around these forest belts over here. But again, this does shorten the front line, which will help Ukraine as the defenders over here, because they're sort of assuming the defensive role in this regard, and so shortening the front line will be better for them in holding on to key pieces of territory. It also relieves pressure off of the T-0504 highway in Chasiv Yar, as I said before. But now let's look at Russia's gains within the city of Bakhmut itself. So when we go over here, we can see the fact that the Russians have fully cleared that pocket that we've been talking about in previous videos. That is to the east of the rail line. I said this before, but now it's been basically confirmed by a lot of Russian sources, and I was one of the earlier people to mention the fact that the Russians had to clear out this pocket, so I'm just restating it so we all know that the front line is basically around the rail line. It just around this red line that I'm drawing over here. But it is important to note that the Russians are already beginning to cross this rail line. There's fighting around a bus station, there's fighting around this transit hotel, and so the fighting is starting to move away from the rail line and towards some of these residential areas that are, again, less dense in nature, and it could present an opportunity for Russia to make some gains before they have to reach the major apartment complexes that I've been talking about on the western side of the city. Now, the Russians actually did successfully cross the rail line in a certain portion of the front line, and you can see how a certain bulge was created as a result. So the place where the Russians crossed the rail line was actually on the T-0504 road, which is a road that I was talking about just before. And so you can see that there was a crossing across the rail line that the Russians used, so they were able to cross the sort of a line of demarcation between the two sides, and they were able to occupy positions within some apartment buildings that could be used as fire positions. And you can see in this frame that there are a lot of different high-rise buildings in the adjacent areas. You can see, like, over here there's some apartments. You can see here there's some other facilities. There's a medical college, which I would say is sort of the entrance into the entire apartment complex in western Bakhmut. Then if you look to the north, there's a lot of different garages and different warehouses that could in theory be used as defensive fortifications, and each house counts in this regard. So here there's a geolocation. You can see the clashes between the Ukrainian and the Russian forces, and it is house to house, apartment to apartment. And you could see in the video the small arms fire going on, the fire exchanges between the two sides, the use of rocket launchers. And again, it's mainly just infantry fighting against one another. I would assume that the Wagner Group is the one in charge of conducting these assaults. And again, they're mainly happening at night, so just remember this. And this sort of penetration, I think that Wagner, they will take advantage of this, and that it's in an effort to flank the Ukrainian groupings in these warehouses and garages, because we've heard reports from Russian sources that this area is pretty well mined. So there's a lot of fortifications that Ukrainian sappers set up in the weeks leading up to this. And so now this two-pronged attack could complicate the situation for the Ukrainian defenders over here. We already know that the Ukrainian positions over here are being shelled constantly, and we could also see how the Russians are pushing from the northern flank, and now they're pushing in from this eastern flank to try to squeeze out the Ukrainians from another key defensive node. Now, once this falls, then they will have direct access to the apartment complexes. And again, they also want to advance and flank the apartment complexes directly to the north, which could be done by taking over these residential areas over here that I'm circling. And we're going to get to that in a second. So if we go up, the Russians, they also secured the grain elevators and other granary facilities around here. This actually, it was done previously, but now it's being talked about by a lot of Russian sources, and they're using this grain elevator as a launching point for new attacks onto these more residential streets and blocks. So you can see that the front line has shifted. The Russians have taken over some new apartment blocks, not apartment blocks, but residential blocks over here. You can see generally this is how the front line shifted. Just a rough sketch to show what occurred since the last video. It looks something like this. And so you can see clearly that there's been a Russian push towards the garages and warehouses first of all, but also there's been a push into the residential areas directly to the north of the apartment complexes. So these are the residential areas I'm talking about. You have a lot of Ukrainian forces situated in here trying to hold out for as long as possible to protect the northern flank of the apartment buildings and to protect the supply lines into Bakhmut. So the Russians, they recently took over the social services office in this area, which gives them access to the residential blocks. So we're going to see some more gains by the Russians in the coming days as they continue to expand their control there. Now, their gains around here, which are again pretty close to this reservoir, this body of water over here, where we did also talk about there being glide bomb strikes, and so I'm sure that Russia will utilize more of those as they approach more extensive fortifications. So on here, you could see I mapped out this yellow path. This is just a minor road that could be used to enter Kromove. So this is a new potential vector of attack for the Russians that hadn't really been considered previously. But this is a new route for Russia to enter Kromove. Again, Kromove is important because a lot of roads that originate from Chasiv Yar, they link up in this town before they enter Bakhmut. So in terms of resupply, it is very critical that the Ukrainians have a strong, firm control over Kromove, which means that even the outskirts of Kromove need to be under Ukrainian control to prevent constant Russian fire on the town. But now we're seeing that the Russians are moving towards this road. I think the name of the road is something like Pirnia Street. I don't know how to say that. But again, there could be an attack on here. And it's not the only area where Kromove could be attacked from. There's also another area where Russia has made gains, and this is on the northern flank. Now, remember what I said about the flanks. Wagner is not really as present on the flanks anymore. And so it's possible that the Russian regular army is conducting these attacks, actually. So it's pretty interesting. Because on the northern flank, they're making gains, but on the southern flank, they had to retreat. Probably has to do with the fact that the gains in the northern flank are more related to the city of Bakhmut directly, and I'll show you why. Because previously the main Russian node or like fort position was around this train station over here, so they've been pushing towards this road through open fields, and now they've secured a key forest belt that is directly to the north of the T0506 highway, and so now the front line is so close to the road that it's actually likely that the Russians have already stepped foot on it physically. And according to the Russian sources that were reporting on this, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade was the unit that was trying to hold on to this road, but then they were eventually dislodged. And it's not just Russian sources. There's also the Deep State map, which is a pro-Ukraine map. They also show the Russians in control of this specific force belt, which can't be controlled in isolation. You also obviously have to be in control of the fields adjacent to it and be in control of the trenches around it in order to actually have a solid control. And so now this will basically cut off the main route into Bakhmut from the north, but there's still another minor route that could be used that links up with Kromove. So you see how this sort of makes a semicircle shape. So that entire semicircle portion of the route could be avoided if the Ukrainians use this minor road around here and they eventually link up with Kromove and then enter Bakhmut. So that's another possibility, and that's why, as I said before, it's important for the Russians to take over the town of Kromove, which could be done from here, and it can be done in conjunction with attacks that are done by the Russians on the northern flank. And so that's really the outlook for Bakhmut. Again, supply lines are going to be very difficult to hold. Ukraine is sending reinforcements towards those supply lines as a result. They are gearing in for a protracted defense of the western portion of the city, so don't expect the fall of Bakhmut to be imminent. But again, it is just deteriorating. So that's all for today. Thank you guys for watching,